The English, do we exist?
Wow.
Are we real?
We're getting decolonized out of our own universities.
Stelios has just poked me.
Yeah, but if we don't exist, what are they decolonizing in Oxford?
Exactly.
Right.
And who are they going to blame?
Yeah, exactly.
They'll find other people to blame, but they're also blaming the...
Oh, this is my favorite thing. Diversity built Britain. Oh, right. So is it responsible for the empire? No, that's the white people. Oh, okay.
Also, it didn't build Britain. You know?
No, of course not. But it's their own premise, you know.
You know, post World War II, even if it did build Britain, it's a worse version of Britain. So,
Britain was
well done.
a great empire right up until the end of World War II.
Diversity ruined Britain, even by their own standards. But anyway, recently, Robert Jenrick went on Sky News and spoke to Matt Bartlett, whoever that is. I think he's some Welsh fella. And he's obviously a Conservative leadership hopeful. And this guy interrupted him saying, I'm going to interrupt you. What is English identity? Which is a very strange question to ask. And as it has been pointed out by one of the lead writers at the Telegraph here, if you recognise the idea of a distinctly Scottish, Welsh and Irish identity, which the guy interviewing did, then you implicitly concede the existence of an English identity as the remainder. It's not particularly controversial outside of the small circle of people who work in media and politics. And I thought that this was quite succinctly put, and I wanted to give credit where credit is due here.
It's not a good answer.
It's not far enough, though. I am going to build upon this. It's basically saying that even by his own standards, it's wrong. But I'm going to I'm going to completely move out of the paradigm. Stop being a stick in the mud. I'm going to move out of this paradigm and say being English is genetic. None of this other stuff about values, passports.
That's not what he asked.
It's not.
He didn't say what is it to be English, because you are right. Mm-hmm. That is the case, right? What he asked is, what is English identity?
Mm-hmm. But it's ballooned into the...
But that's because everyone misread what he was asking for, mm-hmm. right? The answer to this is it's the felt experience of one's own ethnic identity in the context of the English people, right? Mm-hmm. That I don't... Because the problem is, as soon because everyone else is taking an outside view of this, right? And going, okay, well, it's cricket, it's, playing on the green, it's tea and crumpets, and they can pick all of these things apart. But when you say no, it's the subjective felt experience of being English that the English people themselves feel. Mm-hmm. You don't have to justify or validate that in any other way. And that's what this guy's trying to, from the external perspective, zero in on. But it's just easier to begin in the inside and say, this is what it is, in the same way that the Scottish, the Welsh, and the Irish, and every other identity. Mm-hmm. That's what an ethnic identity is. And there's just no further conversation to be had at that point.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree with what you're saying there. So, I was getting to it, yeah.
But it's just, because I watched everyone responding to this, and I was just like, just say it's the way we feel about being English. And they'll be like, okay, what do you mean? What do you mean? What do I mean? That's the same as anyone else, and we don't need to justify it.
But that's also something that only someone who is ethnically English can do.
That's correct.
There we go.
And now, but notice where you are there,
mm-hmm.
I don't have to justify myself any further, and you can't disprove me.
Yep.
Right, there's no standard by which you can disprove, and it means that any English person who feels English mm-hmm. can express their Englishness in the way that they like. And I'm taking all of this from the critical race theorists.
So
they set the standard.
If you're not suffering from an identity crisis, buy our magazine Islander, because it will stave away this sort of thing, because it's got lots of good things in it, and you can go on our website and you can find a link to our shop where you can buy both the magazine and the corresponding merch, mugs and t-shirts for only a couple of weeks now. It'll remain, and then you'll miss it forever.
But this kind of subjective understanding of identity is a part of what Islander is about. The thing is, there's a through line through the whole thing that is essentially ground ourselves in what we are and how we are, and these things therefore flow from it. We don't have to constantly be on the defensive. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of principle that underpins it.
It's basically what my poem is at the end.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. That's exactly my point.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely go and get it. Honestly, we're so on the money with all of this stuff. That's the thing. we're so far ahead of the curve. I love it.
So let's annoy ourselves and look at some stupid people. So
Alan Ray, my favourite.
Yeah, so Robert Jenrick thinks English identity is under threat. Our language is Germanic, our numbers are Arabic and Indian, our patron saint is Palestinian, our royal family has German ancestry, and the church originates from the Middle East. I mean, apart from that,
Right. So this is exactly what I was talking about. He's taken a load of external characteristics and said, well, there we go. But it's, again, very much like the baking the cake. Well, my ingredients all come from the cupboard. The sugar came from there. The water came from the tap. And therefore, I don't have a cake. It's like, no, I have a cake. I'm about to eat it. You know, just because I can identify the ingredients doesn't mean the thing doesn't exist. And even then, the English identity is a felt experience by the people who hold it. Not that I'd expect Adil Ray to understand that, because he's not English.
Well, it's similar, like English identity is very similar in my mind, at least, to things like beauty or these sort of metaphysical concepts. I know it when I see it. I don't need to have a checklist of criteria and run through it like a robot. I can just tell.
No, that's true.
Because it's sort of baked into me.
Yes.
I have a question here, because it seems to me that the felt experience aspect isn't particularly important in it, because it seems to me that there are Greek people who don't feel Greek if you ask them, and there are English people that don't feel English if you ask them.
But whenever I go to Greece, man, everyone's very Greek, even if they don't feel Greek. You know.
Yes, exactly. So what I'm saying is that maybe the felt experience bit of it isn't the way to go about it. So I would view it more as a combination between biological and cultural.
It's not only one thing.
Yeah.
You know, as you're saying, but when they say what is English identity, well, that English identity is not what are all the characteristics of being English. What it is what is the identity, and the identity is how English people feel about themselves. Like in the same way as like what's Greek identity? What's how Greeks feel about their Greekness, right? And then you can add characteristics onto it. But that's the sort of core foundation that can't actually be chipped away from, because you get no say in whether I feel English or not. You know,
there's a very uncontroversial way of explaining, actually, saying, well, a shark biologically is this thing, this is the category, here's how it behaves, here's where it resides, here is how it differs from other animals that are similar to it.
Yeah,
you can do it outside of the human sphere as well.
But that's, I mean, like, if English identity, what do you mean our language is Germanic? What's a Germanic language? You know, it's exactly the same problem. He's just kicking the ball further down the road. Okay, what's an Arab?
I mean,
what's an Indian?
Many languages are Indo-European. Doesn't mean that.
Well, that's the point.
That only
exactly
Indo-European.
So he'd say, well, it's something from Germany. It's like, oh, well, but that's an Indo-European language, so it didn't come from Germany. Yeah. So we know it came from the Asian steppes, and so we're just kicking. All he's doing is kicking the ball further down the road, in order to just get around the fact that you are an Englishman.
There's also another example whereby there was this MP, was his name Simon or something like that? I don't even want to pronounce it correctly, but he denied that the English exist as an ethnicity.
Yes.
And this is the route we are going down now, is that not only are they, denigrating English culture, they're also denying we are a distinct ethnicity, which is a bit absurd, really. And there have already been attempts, we've actually discussed before, trying to decolonize the term Anglo-Saxon, right? And arguing that we're using the term Anglo-Saxon is somehow, I don't know, racist or nationalist or white supremacist in some way, rather than using it as a descriptor of the cultural aspects. It's not even ethnically true. They have an ethnic imprint, the Anglo-Saxons, but it's not necessarily the majority for most Brittonic people.
You know what's interesting is that we know the words they used to use to describe themselves. Like Bede used the word Engelsin, I think it is, which means essentially English nation.
Yes, that's part of the reason I have a copy of Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People.
Written in the 8th century.
It was, yes.
Before England was even a united kingdom.
Mm-hmm. That is how old it is. It is, over 1,000 years old. It's ridiculous to deny it is its own distinct ethnicity. We have characterized ourselves as such for such a long time. Yes. I don't necessarily, lean towards the Anglo-Saxon label, although I identify with it in the cultural sense. I see myself as more culturally Anglo-Saxon, but genetically I'm very Brittonic. That's fine. There is sort of
the Anglo-Saxons are 30% Germanic and 70% Celtic. So every Anglo
by the sort of end of the Anglo-Saxon era, sort of by the 11th century. Yeah.
But I meant modern. Every modern. English
person
is about 30% Anglo-Saxon.
Well, it stayed the same over that period of time.
Yeah, for 1,000 years.
Exactly.
So the ethnogenesis of the English people by about the 11th century was pretty much set in stone from that point.
Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
been the same way ever since.
Because the Normans didn't really leave much of a genetic imprint, a very slight one.
Yeah. Very
Same with the Romans. In fact,
Romans
there's
left
not.
virtually none.
That's because we killed them all.
Well, they left.
They
a
left
long time.
and we genocided them a little.
We didn't. I don't
did a
think we
little bit
genocide.
of genocide. Boudica went through and
Oh,
killed
that
all the
wasn't
Roman.
genocide. That was actually a really pathetic failed revolt. She managed to destroy one town. That wasn't genocide. The Romans just left.
Well, they got the message, didn't they?
Well, no, because they were here.
It's okay.
They were here for 400 years,
I'm
and the
only
empire
being-
started collapsing, and they were like, "Look to your own defences." And the British were like, "No, you're not allowed to do that." And they were like, "Yeah, we're off," and they left.
I'm being silly anyway. So, another example here. Here's Michael Rosen. Generic mentions history. It follows that for English identity to be a thing, there would need to be a distinct, separate thing called English history that's different from Scots history, Welsh history, Northern Irish history, and different from, but a part of British history.
But there is.
Have you read a book, Michael? I know you like poetry.
I'm not going to get into theories of history here, but that's obviously true. You can obviously say that there is an English history.
But also,
Or
no
Scottish
country
history.
exists outside of external influence, does it?
No, of course.
Like, of course, there's
Well,
it's intertwined with Scottish history and Welsh history because we're next door to each other.
The very nature of the question of history, and this is sort of the Francis Fukuyama issue, it means ethnic groups and events between them. That's essentially what history means. So all of history is essentially ethnic history. And this is what the end of history is meant to bring about, where it's just the reign of the individual. So there isn't like the mass movements of national events anymore. That's literally what the end of history is meant to mean. So all of history is ethnic history.
I don't disagree.
Am I wrong, Stelios?
I don't think so.
I don't think I'm wrong either.
It's a side of history of human affairs that is irreducible. So
Yeah, exactly.
it's part of it. So
So like Michael Rosen here being like, well, there'd have to be a separate thing called Scottish history. There is Scottish history. What do you
Yeah, of course there is.
I really don't understand this. This is
It's a silly argument, isn't it?
a very silly argument.
And Connor's also pointed out in one of his Twitter essays, but I'm going to go to the screenshot here. David Lammy, if anyone needs to integrate, it's the far right, which obviously he's on about the native English
Yeah. Well, 'cause
more than anyone.
the rights were only in England. So
And they're trying to frame it as if the native English needs to integrate with our schemes, basically.
yes.
Which is ridiculous. No, we don't. It's our country. You need to integrate with us, actually, mate.
And a multiculturalist who is against integration is saying that some people have to integrate.
Yes.
Just double standards, but don't want to
Interesting.
derail the segment.
And also, sorry,
Sorry, no, far right just means English in this context.
it does. It's
If
the
anyone
English,
needs to integrate, it's the English. Makes far more sense
It does, doesn't it?
than far right, whatever that is.
Rioters long for a Britain that never existed, says Trevor Phillips as well.
It did exist.
It's
I lived through it.
yeah, it still does as long as I'm still alive. As long
Yeah.
as the English people are still on this island, England still exists. Although he's on about Britain, but what he means is England.
Yeah.
Obviously, because it's not Scotland and Wales that he's complaining about, is it? Or Northern Ireland. But anyway, here's another one. It's quite hard for 84% of the population to be the remainder. One reason why there is no distinct English/British identity and why Generic could not answer is the average British person is English. That's just maths. So
That's a great point.
this argument
That's
is
a great point.
basically just saying that English culture is so dominant that it's taken over the whole idea of being British in the first place,
Yeah.
which is a reasonable point. He then goes on to be annoying because he's a former Guardian writer, and
Was he?
yeah. So I believe it's in his replies. It's a question of shared beliefs, histories, and traditions, and it's frankly just impossible for the huge country in the metaphorical and literal centre of the country that produced Shakespeare, the Beatles, and hosts. I understand the argument he's
That's
making
totally true. He's right about this.
about the actual cultural aspect, and lots of sort of our people went after him for this, and I thought it was one of the least egregious examples. But he's missing out the ethnic component.
Sure.
However, the cultural stuff, it seems to be correct that yes, because England is the bigger country, its culture has
a huge margin.
infringed on that of Wales and Scotland, and we're noticing the same in sort of reverse with America and its relation with the British Isles as well, and the American culture, because it's a larger
Canada.
country, is influencing our way of life to the point where people are using Americanisms in our daily life that infuriates me personally. I mean, if you're American, that's perfectly fine. I'm not having a go at you. But if you're British, you should be ashamed of yourself. And this is actually quite a commonly held view, because we see ourselves as distinct, because we've got to have pride in who we are. And here's another one as well. This is, I believe, who was this again? Rakib-Hassan, arguing that Jenrick is right to call out the metropolitan disdain for Englishness. The deep cultural roots of England are nothing to be ashamed of. There is no contradiction between celebrating English history and being welcoming to newcomers. Yes, there is, because the newcomers are the ones that are undermining it in the first place.
Well, hang on. It depends on the paradigm that you're operating under. So if you're operating under what I'm just going to call the sort of tribal English paradigm, where, okay, a foreigner can come in and, you know, join the tribe, come and sit at the engage in the rituals, marry, and have descendants. That's totally fine. If you're going to come to the pubs with us, then people will happily accept you, and there's not a problem, because English culture is the dominant paradigm, and the English people, of course, the dominant people in the culture. But if you have a multicultural country, like Stelios was pointing out, I mean, like Stelios being here right now, right? Like, you know, there's no contradiction with him being Greek and being like, yeah, the English need to set their identity up and sort it out. I'd be the same if I was in Greece, you know, I'd be, you know, a massive Greek patriot.
Well, it angers me when other European countries have this done to them as well.
Yeah, me too. I hate it. And just any other country, really. But there's no contradiction there. It's whether you're setting up a colony of your own culture or you're integrating and joining into the culture that you want that you've come into. And so in the multicultural paradigm, they're like, no, colonies. It's like, okay, well, that's bad, and that has to stop. So Rakim here, I do agree with him. I think he's correct.
Okay. So I tweeted out this in response to some of this stuff, just emphasising the genetic point that you can't convert and become English. You are born into it. It's not a passport or a set of values. You should see the number of leftists saying this is made up nonsense, scientific revisionism, ahistoric, ignorant. I haven't read any history. I don't know anything about genetics, despite, you know, actually reading a ton of genetic research.
But it's definitionally true that your ethnic identity is inherited.
Even if you Google this, Google will agree with you.
Well, obviously.
Yeah.
It's the fact of it.
So even Google hasn't caught up with this new delusion that everyone's going to pretend is just normal and received wisdom for thousands of years. But even the BBC in 2016 frames it in these terms: English DNA, 1/3 Anglo-Saxon. So English as the identity, DNA, and they're talking about the Anglo-Saxons as being a part of it. This is perfectly ordinary, perfectly
Completely
normal.
comprehensible.
Yes, of course. And I think Survive the Jive did a very good video on this, talking about Englishness. One thing that he points out, which I think is particularly important, and I encourage people to watch the video, is that there was a man buried in a pagan Germanic burial mound who had entirely Brythonic ancestry, probably very similar to mine. Implies that the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons integrated to the point where the Brittonic people could achieve high status in Anglo-Saxon society, and so it makes sense to see them as compatible groups because they had become one, more or less.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he undoubtedly married an Anglo-Saxon woman. So he would have literally married into the tribe. As historically, this is always the way that tribes dealt with this, is you would literally take wives and husbands from the other tribe to make sure that there was no, like, split between them. It was like, and it was a conscious thing as well. I can't remember which tribe it was now.
Taking hostages, isn't it? It's
in a way,
in a weird sort of way, yeah.
But there was a particular event. I can't remember where I was reading about it, but it was like the 1st century or something. But this Germanic and Celtic tribe were like, okay, we're just going to join up, and so literally every single one of them chose a husband or wife from the other tribe, and that was it. And then they changed the name, or they had another name for the tribe, and that was it. And it's just like, that's just the way it worked.
But it also suggests that this mix has remained relatively consistent as well. Because, of course, let's not forget that the name of Wales means foreigner in Anglo-Saxon. And that's where the Britons who didn't integrate fled to.
Yes.
And it's also why...
And Brittany as well, actually.
That's true, yeah. That's also why my ancestry from Devon and southern Scotland is very much not Anglo-Saxon. and why I look like I do and not more white. But anyway, let's move on to some of the other stuff. So Y-DNA haplogroups are very useful because it also reinforces this point that in the sort of grand scheme of things, people from Western Europe, which includes Germany and Northern Germany, where a lot of the Anglo-Saxons come from, are quite related to the people in the British Isles anyway. You know, they're a similar generation of people, if you know what I mean.
Man, you could map that RU 106 to the Protestant Revolution, couldn't you?
You could, yeah.
That is really... That's basically a map of Protestantism.
It is. And
interesting.
It's amazing how much genetics actually determine national borders. Like, you can see the difference between northern and southern Italy there. Yeah. You can see Western and Eastern Europe. You can see the Balkans as distinct. All of these things that have entered into our language actually have a biological basis.
How are Balkans Proto-Europeans?
I'm not entirely sure.
It's very interesting.
Don't pay too much attention to those because there's a better one here which shows you the genetic national makeup of Y-DNA haplogroups, and you can see the pie, right? You used the cake analogy earlier. You can also use a pie one where each nationality has a unique sort of blend. Of course, these are averaged amongst the people, but there aren't any countries here that look incredibly similar to the point where you think, should they just merge and become one? They all seem distinct enough.
Scotland and England look pretty bloody similar, don't they?
They are quite similar, but then again, you know, that's because a lot of it is Brittonic ancestry, isn't it? And sure, there was some variance there, but there's still a lot of shared heritage as well. And so there's less difference. That's why we're a union, and that's pretty unique in Europe because we are so similar.
There's not much in it, actually. I expected there to be more genetic difference.
But yes, you all of a sudden, the nation states of Europe make sense if you start looking at it from a genetic level. And these ethnic groups are tangible and real, and they actually inform very, very real ways in which humans view each other. Because genetics, I would argue, is the determining factor in how, as in if you had to rank order them all, it is the determining factor of how people treat each other. Because as we will see in a minute.
Before we move on,
okay, sure.
I'm surprised at the distinction between Spain and Portugal there.
Well, yeah, I think that
Different, aren't they?
you look at just purely the size of the Spanish nation and the size of Portugal, other than the savvy alliance that Portugal made with us. Well done for that. You would think that Spain would have conquered Portugal at some point because...
Well, they did have unions of crowns and stuff like that.
Of course.
Anyway, sorry.
But they've remained as distinct, haven't they, because of this genetically distinct...
populations.
Exactly.
The identity is inherited through the generations. It's just how it works.
Mm-hmm. And so you can even get it in this. So this is a research paper, and it's talking about racial categorization of faces. And pretty much participants were able to categorize faces according to the nationality with a certain degree of accuracy. So you could actually look at someone and say, they're from this country, and it's more accurate than chance.
I can do that.
I know, yeah, it's quite easy, which suggests that there is an ethnic component because you can look at someone and say they're from this place.
I can pick out the German out of a lineup.
Oh, quite easily.
Yeah, but I'm not even joking.
You don't even need to see their socks and sandals, either, do you?
I can literally do it by face.
So they also found that categorization occurs quickly and subconsciously, highlighting how innate this is to human nature. This is our ability to recognize who is part of our tribe and who is not. And this is part of human nature, and if you deny the ethnic component to people's identity, you deny something that's so integral to how human beings function that you sort of castrate our ability to function normally. And
but that's what they're trying to do, isn't it?
That's true, yes, of course. And this is such a powerful effect that even though there is an own race bias in facial perception, whereby unfamiliar faces from other races are usually remembered more poorly than your own race's faces.
Okay.
And even in multicultural society or multiracial societies, this persists, which suggests that this is biological.
I can't believe nature isn't liberal.
I know. Yeah.
I can't believe it.
Mm-hmm. So there's also this as well. So a new theory of attraction and liking based on kin selection suggests that people detect genetic similarity in others in order to give preferential treatment to those who are more similar to themselves. And this is 100% true in my opinion. all of the literature on how human beings interact with genes, people give preferential treatment to people who look like them.
Unless they're liberals.
Yes, in which case they have an outgroup preference.
I think this applies to the whole animal kingdom, because they say that when it comes to pets, a lot of people have pets that sort of resembles them. So, for instance, if some people are more like bulldogish, they're likely to have bulldog. If they have other features, they say that it plays a lot of great role.
That's very true, yeah. And it's also worth mentioning as well, there's this sort of colloquial anecdote whereby we say that couples that kind of look like one another, they could potentially be cousins or brother or sister. I know I'm from Devon, yes. But they stay together longer, and it's perhaps because they're more genetically compatible. And there's a certain aspect of genetic compatibility. It's why people give primarily the most preferential treatment to their family, then to their their more distant family, then to their friends, then to their community, then to their nation. There's this sort of onion of layers moving out here, and that is just purely based on genetic proximity. And this paper, which is Cambridge University Press, it's not controversial, lists a whole host of reasons here in evidence that supports this. And this, I think, is why we should care about this sort of thing, why we should be a bit more ethnocentric, because people will treat us better if they're more genetically proximate to us. Unless they're leftists, who should be crushed politically. And so, if we want to be treated fairly, treated in a way in which is in keeping with our culture, there has to be consideration of genetics, because this informs human behaviour, whether we like it or not. You can't really overcome it unless you become a weird, maladapted leftist, and who wants that? You can be, Keir Starmer, or a childless cat lady, or a spiteful leftist that makes himself look ugly and lives in London and has no property because they're a failure. I mean, this is not a life that you want to pursue. However, I think that the notion that English is somehow this amorphous thing, it's just a set of values, it's just a passport, which many immigrants, when quizzed on the street, will say.
Ironically, there's no English passport.
No, there's not. There's only a British one.
It's only an ethnic group.
Mm-hmm.
There's no English state.
So yes, I wanted to highlight the importance of recognising being English as an ethnicity and how it informs our nature. I hope you appreciated that segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters, and if you want to see what else we're putting out, you can follow Connor's series, Tomlinson Talks, where he talks to lots of interesting guests, this time with Katie Faust. And if you want to see what else we're putting out, you can follow us on Twitter. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.